Chapter 7. That Christmas Eve morning, Zeke grabbed his keys and tossed each of his pups their own non-raw hide chew bone, leaving to go to Tucson to volunteer at a food bank. Arriving at the location he'd seen online, not only was there a long line of people seeking a holiday meal, but there had been an abundance of volunteers as well. "I'm sorry," the head of the event said. "Other than Thanksgiving, today and tomorrow are the most volunteered on days. We just don't need any more volunteers today. I'm sorry, but thank you so much for thinking of us. If you want to come back tomorrow, we'll be doing this again. Just make sure you get here around 9 a.m. Otherwise, all the spots may be filled." Zeke thanked her and headed back to his car, pulling out his phone to check for other locations he could potentially volunteer or help at. He found several, but after being turned away for the fourth time, he had decided that it just wasn't meant to be. He pulled out of the shelter's parking lot, and after a couple of turns on his way to the freeway, he pulled up to a red light. He never really paid them much attention, but he found his eyes turning to the signs taped to the light post at the intersection. There was a sign for Cash for Homes, promising to somehow give 10% over market value. There was another sign for free puppies, something that pissed Zeke off to no end. And there was a third sign taped above the others, a black arrow standing out against the neon pink of the sign itself. It pointed down the road saying, "Community Holiday Food Bank." Zeke decided to check it out. The food bank was being held at a small church, and there was a group of elderly people making their way into the building as Zeke pulled into a parking spot. The building itself was the typical American church, the kind where everything seemed mass-produced to recreate the look of a 19th century chapel. Even the stained glass windows, though Zeke still found them pretty, struck him as a mass-produced recreation. Just inside the lobby, an elderly man in his Sunday best was greeting people as they entered the church. "Merry Christmas, son," the man said to Zeke, his eyes bright and smile genuine. "Merry Christmas," Zeke replied. "Come on in. We've got plenty of food for you." Zeke smiled politely. "Actually, I was hoping there was something I could do to help. Like, do you need any more volunteers or anything like that?" The man's smile brightened even more. "I'm sure we can find something for you," he said, ushering Zeke into the main hall. There weren't many tasks, but Zeke volunteered to be their gopher for a few hours. He'd be there to help take out the trash, wash dishes, and clean off the tables, and he didn't mind. The pastor was grateful. The day was going by quickly, and though he wasn't feeling like he was helping anyone specifically, he knew he was at least helping the cause. Because he was there to make sure the trash bins were empty, someone else didn't have to worry about it and could instead be on the food line. He was there to make sure that the tables were cleaned and ready for the next guests so that someone else could make sure that the next batch of food was ready to replace what had been eaten. By mid-afternoon, the banquet hall, nestled directly under the nave, was filled with the clamor of chattering and laughing voices. There were nearly 24 tables filling the room, with 6 chairs each, and nearly every chair was filled. The kitchen staff reached a point where they just couldn't keep certain foods replenished as quickly as needed. The moment a fresh batch of turkey was put on the line, it was nearly gone. There was a sense of joy in the air, one that permeated through Zeke and made him feel alive. Several times throughout the day, however, he'd hear the laughter fade. He'd see their figures fade. Everyone in this room will soon be dead. In those moments, the joy in the room actually became overbearing, and the subconscious fear would fight back with a vengeance, throwing the words at him over and over again. Each time he'd wanted to collapse. He wanted to go to his knees and sob and scream and kick and punch. Instead, as that desire grew, he'd closed his eyes and with great focus on his breathing, he'd collected himself each time, reiterating the point that they all deserved a good last Christmas. After several hours, the church was beginning to clean things up for the day. Just as they were going to close the doors, an elderly man Zeke felt surely was nearly a centenarian shuffled in. He walked slowly with a cane and a limp, his back hunched. Just the sight of the man brought to life pity within Zeke. They let him come in, closing the doors after, he being their last of the day. The selection of food was still pretty good at that point, but it wasn't as full as it had been. The man didn't seem too picky, though. There was something about his demeanor and age that struck Zeke, his eyes remaining on the man as he switched out a trash bag. After throwing away the bag, Zeke came back into the dining area. The large open space, once full of people, was now down to just 2 families and the elderly man. Zeke began wiping down tables, still keeping an eye on him. After several minutes, Zeke saw the pastor enter the room, and he just couldn't help himself. "Pastor Will, hey," Zeke called as he moved to the young pastor. "Hey, Zeke. Thanks for all your help today. You heading out?" "Oh, no, not yet. I just wanted to check if you guys needed anything else from me right now. Was going to sit down with that older guy that just came in." Pastor Will's smile was wide and bright. "No, Zeke, I think that'd be fantastic." Zeke shook the pastor's hand and turned back to the room, his eyes falling on the solitary figure. Zeke knew it was the last Christmas, and he didn't want someone who seemed so superficially sweet to spend it alone. There was something else, though. Zeke couldn't put his finger on it, but he was feeling the need to know that man's story. As he now knew he would never live to see that age, for the first time, he found himself truly curious about what such longevity truly meant and looked like. "Excuse me," Zeke said, trying not to startle the man who hadn't seen him approach. Looking up, "Yes? Is it time for me to go?" "Oh, no, definitely not. Take your time. Go back for seconds, even." "All right, then. Well, what can I do for you?" "I just saw you eating alone, and with it being a bit slower, I just came to see if you wanted some company." The man's eyes grew watery for a moment, and he gestured for Zeke to sit. "Take a seat. I'm Bob." The man held out his shaking hand. Zeke took it, its cold stark against the heat of the room. "Nice to meet you, Bob. I'm Zeke. What brings you here today?" "You mean, why am I eating alone in a church on Christmas Eve?" Zeke nodded. "Nothing else better to do, really." "Nothing? No one to go see or come see you?" Bob didn't answer. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry or anything." "No, you're fine. I don't have any family anymore. My wife passed away about 10 years ago, and my son passed away a few years back. His wife always invites me to spend the holidays with her, but her family isn't really my family. I don't want to impose on them." "I'm sorry about your wife and son," Zeke said. Bob smiled faintly as he took a bite of mashed potatoes. "Thank you. Oh, what about you? What brings you to the First Assembly of God here on Christmas Eve? No wife or kids to spend the holidays with?" "I've got an ex-wife somewhere in Tennessee, but I haven't seen or talked to her in years. We were married less than a year, and luckily we didn't have kids."
"Luckily? You don't want kids?"
Not if we were going to get divorced. I mean, I wanted kids. I want kids, but I'm just glad we didn't have any since it did end in divorce. Zeke was surprised at how quickly he found himself comfortable with sharing such personal information with a complete stranger. Perhaps it was the unassuming and frail nature of someone as aged as Bob, but Zeke felt instantly like he could tell the man everything. Evidently, the man felt the same way about Zeke, too. Just a few minutes later, the man was starting to tell Zeke his whole life story, right back to being born at the close of World War II. Bob was a Vietnam veteran. He'd volunteered the minute he turned 18 so that he wouldn't be drafted. He had figured that if he were to sign up, he'd get to choose what he did, rather than be drafted and forced into a specific role. Being just 5 feet 4 inches tall, he told Zeke, he was worried that he'd be turned into a tunnel rat. They'd volunteer the small guys to go into the Viet Cong tunnels in order to try and clear them of enemy soldiers. Instead, he joined up as a helicopter pilot, just barely being tall enough to qualify.
"It was the darndest thing,"
Bob snorted as he took a bite of apple pie.
"They were worried I'd be too short. See, in order to fly a helicopter, you have to be able to reach a pair of pedals. I was right at the cusp. It was so close that someone, I forget who, told me to spend a few days in bed before I reported. They said that staying in bed for a long time could actually make someone taller."
"Really? Lying in bed could make you taller? Well, crap, Zeke joked. If only I'd known that lying in bed was all I needed to do to hit 6 feet. Bob laughed.
It really does help. Something to do with the cartilage in the joints decompressing, I believe. Whatever the cause, though.
Bob's smile and devious look in the eye told Zeke that the man was about to lay a hard joke on him.
I don't know if it would have ever helped quite that much.
Ouch, Zeke laughed, taking absolutely no offense to the joke. He did set himself up for it.
But it did help enough, Bob continued. In fact, when my official height was taken, I had grown nearly 3/4 of an inch. I grew so much that my military documents were the only ones I ever had where my official height was actually 5'5".
That's hilarious, Zeke laughed. So you became a pilot? Bob nodded.
Sure did. Spent a number of months training, but late in '68 I was sent off to Vietnam. When I got over there, I started work as a Huey pilot. Mostly we took soldiers to and from specific areas. Sometimes they were easy trips. Sometimes, though,
Bob slowed, and Zeke noted the distance that had fogged his eyes. There was obviously some sort of scene playing just on the other side of them, flickering memories that Zeke couldn't see, but that were more than real to Bob.
Sometimes things got a bit hairy.
Sensing Bob's shift toward melancholy, Zeke tried to turn the conversation toward something that was a bit more positive, despite how interested he was in Bob's time at war. What about your wife? What was her name? When did you meet her? Instantly, the fog of war-torn memories was cleared away from Bob's eyes, now being replaced by a shine of love.
Her name was Nancy. She and we actually grew up together. We're from the same area of Vermont. Grew up actually 2 blocks away from each other in a town of just a few thousand. In fact,
Bob chuckled to himself, but the memory that caused the chuckle was so strong that he couldn't contain it. It spread to full-fledged laughter. What? The word came out of Zeke's mouth almost as a laugh, but Zeke had no idea why he was laughing. What is it?
I just hadn't thought about her family in years. The last of her siblings passed away a good 20 years ago, and their kids and I were never close. I had just forgotten that out of her 3 brothers and 2 sisters and my brother and 4 sisters, the only one that hadn't dated a member of the other family was my youngest sister.
The pair turned as a crash of plates came from the far end of the room. Zeke looked around, but the pastor motioned for him to stay as the man moved into the kitchen. So, everyone in y'all's family dated each other at some point? That's crazy.
That's the life of a kid in a small town. June, my youngest sister, had come along about 12 years after the last, so she was the only one that never got involved with the other family. My brother, Larry, dated my wife's sister Janice, but he also dated her sister Brenda. It was a mess, but like I said, such is living in a small town.
Zeke laughed heartily. So you two were actually together pretty much forever?
Well, no, actually. Yeah, there was some commingling, but she ran in a slightly different crowd than I did. She ran in the more religious crowd, while I ran in more of the strictly books and studies club. We actually didn't really spend any time together until somehow one of my friends got her to say yes to going out with him. Back then, as far as most guys were concerned, she was one of the most attractive girls in town. And I don't mean attractive as in just being pretty. She definitely was. She had long black hair that did whatever she wanted it to, and her eyes were something that just lit up a room. There was something else about her that just attracted people to her. Wherever she was, people just felt like they needed to be around her. So when my buddy came up and told me he had gotten her to go out with him, I was shocked. She and I hadn't really spent time together, but I had always looked at her, though. She was that angel you always strived for, even when you knew you were nothing but a sinner destined for a demon. To say I was jealous would be a bit of an understatement. But see, here's the kicker. My buddy, well, he couldn't drive. Not only did he not have a car, he didn't have a license. Me, I started working at 12. I was helping my dad at a local distribution warehouse for a regional bread company. Today, people would frown on a 12-year-old helping out, but I learned a lot during that time. It wasn't just to make sure I grew up knowing how the world worked either. We didn't have a small family, and feeding so many mouths, let alone keeping them in clothes appropriate for a Vermont winter, wasn't cheap. So Dad made sure they paid me, but once that check came in, half immediately went to the needs of the family. At 12, I was already working to help provide dinner for my brother and sisters. The other half, though, he had plans for. Now, my dad was not a smart man by any means. He wasn't dumb, but he wasn't really smart. He couldn't tell you what a square root was or the planets in the solar system. But one thing Daddy knew was that in order to get ahead, you had to invest what you could. After the family got their half, he split what was left. Half the remaining went into savings, and the other half he invested. The day I turned 16, I was able to walk right into our local Chevy dealer and buy myself a brand new Impala. That meant that my friend without a car was needing a ride for his date with the local angel. And honestly, because of how jealous I was, I may or may not have volunteered to give them a lift. Flash forward a few days, and I'm chauffeuring them on their date. And where do they go? The drive-in. I'm sure you know what taking a date to a drive-in meant in the mid-60s.
Sure do, Zeke said, smiling wryly as he took a sip of water. I've seen Grease.
Oh, it wasn't that ridiculous.
Bob smiled as he pushed his plate toward the center of the table, the room now completely empty other than them.
But it did still have a reputation. I didn't want to see that, so I stepped out of the car. I went and grabbed some popcorn and was just going to go watch the movie near the concession stand. After I finished the popcorn, though, there was still an hour left in the flick, and I had left my smokes in the car. When I went back to go get them, I was expecting to see my buddy in the back seat of my car with his hand halfway up her skirt. You know what I actually saw?
No, what?
My buddy was passed out in the back seat, and she was sitting there looking miserable with her arms crossed. She had the most adorable pout I'd ever seen. I looked at her, and I really couldn't see how anyone, anywhere on the planet, could be as perfect as her.
So, you walk up, and your friend is passed out in the back seat, and there's the girl that you obviously had a thing for just sitting there looking miserable? What did you do?
Son, I did what any cold-blooded human man would do.
Which is?
I nearly peed my pants. But I walked up to the car, I got her attention through the window, and I asked her to step out. There was actually a moment that I didn't think she would. She looked at my friend, and I thought for sure she'd say, "No, thank you, it's a horrible date," but I agreed to go out with him. When she looked back, though, there was a look of relief on her face, and just a few short minutes later, she and I were sitting across from one another at a concession stand table, sharing a plate of nachos and not realizing our lives had changed. From that moment, everything I ever did, I did to make sure she had the best life I could possibly give her, in every possible way I could affect it. She died a while back. We made it 57 years before the cancer finally took her. Seems like these days, sooner or later, we're all caught by the cancer. I'm just glad it was quick for her. No pain and nothing like that.
Bob trailed off. There was a look in his eyes that Zeke had never seen before, and it took him a moment to realize what it was. It was a look of gratification-filled sorrow. It was a look of pain and appreciation that could only come from a lifetime of experiences and love with someone who had been taken away. She sounds like an amazing woman. Even to Zeke, the words sounded flat, but Bob seemed to appreciate them.
"Thank you,"
he said, his eyes growing waterier.
"I haven't told that story in ages. It's felt like she's been slipping away more and more lately. But now—"
He stopped to wipe his eye. Zeke extended his hand across the table instinctively, gripping the elderly man's shoulder reassuringly. As soon as contact was made, Bob stood, the tears from his eyes now spreading to his body. Zeke stood as well, taking Bob into his arms and letting the man silently cry into him.
"Oh, I'm sorry,"
Bob said a few moments later as he composed himself. The embarrassment on his face was clear when he saw that his tears had left imprints on Zeke's shirt. Seeing Bob's look as he eyed the shirt, Zeke looked down, then back up at Bob. "Don't worry. I'll wear it with pride. A love like you seem to have had, Bob, it's worth hundreds of wet shirts." Bob smiled faintly and wished Zeke a Merry Christmas, slowly limping out of the room. Zeke watched the man disappear, his mind filled with images of a life that wasn't his and people he'd never met. It had been an incredible story that was worthy of telling, even if the world wasn't going to exist in a year. Much like the saguaro deserved to be seen, so too did Bob's story deserve to be told and heard. He knew just a small fraction of the man's life story, but he felt as if he knew Bob inside and out. He didn't know about his kids or his life pre-war, but he knew he had kids. He knew he had served, and he knew he had loved as greatly as a man can hope to love. The door to the small banquet hall closing, the last of Bob Zeke would ever see vanishing behind the wood, Zeke knew Bob's tale was one that was the most human of tales, one shaped and directed by love, war, and family. As he drove home that evening, Zeke's mind was alive with the story of Bob's life. He was going through the details of the story, line by line, trying to imagine the events through Bob's eyes as he lived them. Arriving home to his excited pups, Zeke was bombarded by yips and leaps. "Hey, boys," Zeke said, forcing his way inside the door.
I'm back.
"Oh, Herman O'Cagney, were you good boys?" He gave them each a pet and rounded the corner into the main section of the house, the vertical portion of its T-like structure. Everything looked as it had when he left, with no trash or stuffing strewn about. "Yeah, you were good boys." Zeke placed his keys down on the table and began walking to the back door through his office. The dogs were way ahead of him, running to the door and whining before he even got halfway there. He opened it and they bolted. Moving back inside, Zeke grabbed the cigarette on the counter he had allotted for himself that evening and went back outside with his dogs. Inhaling that cancer-ridden smoke, Zeke stared up at the sky. As he looked up at Venus, instead of feeling the dread of that oncoming planet, Zeke instead saw 1,000,000 people. They were standing in a field below him, shoulder to shoulder for as far as the eye could see. They each looked up to the sky. They made the movement in unison, but they were each looking up in their own way. One may have looked up with a shock and blankness that's only caused by extreme circumstances breaking a mind, while others looked up in pure, blind terror. Every one of them opened their mouths, some to scream, some just to say, "Holy shit." Yet as Zeke saw each of their expressions in great detail, there was not a sound to be heard. Even as the earth underneath them shook and crumbled, the Reaper planet striking Earth somewhere on the far-off horizon, the faces, the millions of people in Zeke's mind melted with silent screams. Calling the dogs inside, Zeke tried to shake the terrifying image from his mind. If that was the last thing he thought of before he laid down for bed, then sleep would be unattainable. Shaking the multitude of faces away from his mind, only one remained, and this face had a voice. It was Bob. He was repeating the same line over and over again.
"She was that angel you always strived for, even when you knew you were nothing but a sinner destined for a demon."
Scrunching his eyelids together in as forceful a way as he could, Zeke hoped the motion would clear his mind. Unlike previously, Bob's image in his head was not soothing. Instead, as the words continued repeating, now echoing through the darkness of his mind as Bob's face faded, Zeke felt regret begin to bubble up within him. Once before he had felt that way about someone, the way Bob had felt about Nancy. Only once before had he seen and known someone to have such an impact. Her name was Addison. He'd met her in community theater when he was just 13. They didn't really hit it off relationship-wise right away. Like Bob and Nancy, they generally hung out with different crowds. As they got older, they had gotten closer, and when she was 15 and he was 16, they'd taken each other's virginity. Not long after, things got high school angsty and they stopped talking for a while. Zeke got undressed automatically, popping a melatonin and turning on his fan for the noise. He laid back, his head on his pillow and his eyes on the ceiling above. An image danced through his mind. Though a memory most would consider minor or unimportant, the image Zeke saw in front of him was one that cut straight through to his soul. It was an image that raised questions to the surface, begging what his life would have looked like if the evening that followed that scene hadn't ended in an argument he couldn't even remember the cause of, an argument that had been the first on the path to breaking up. Though it had occurred decades previously, Zeke could see Addison in front of him. He felt he could almost reach out and touch her. He wanted to reach out and touch her. Her strawberry blonde hair, typically uncontainable through the massive curls, had been pulled back into a bun. She had on minimal makeup, just enough to accentuate the gray of her eyes, which he'd found so mysterious and alluring. It was just enough to highlight the beauty of her lips and cheekbones. She didn't overdo it, still allowing for her natural beauty to shine through. When Zeke had looked at her, he had seen everything he ever wanted in life. She had some traditional values, but she also had goals and desires to build something. She had a plan and a goal to create her own charter school, and everything she did from the age of 19 onward was to make sure that goal came to fruition. She had a laugh that made his knees weak, a smile that warmed his insides, and arms that made him feel like he was truly where he belonged. He could see her. They were in their second go at it, their second attempt at making it work, suffering the pains of a long-distance relationship. He was 19 and in LA, and she was 18 in San Francisco. It wasn't too much of a distance, but as two young adults with little money, each trip had to count. He had come to visit for 4 nights, and that was the second night. He wanted to do something special for her, and she had mentioned that she had been wanting to go see something at a theater there in San Francisco. Zeke had spent more money than he should have, making sure that he got good seats for an actual opera. As a kid, doing theater, he had actually been in an opera, just as a background kid, not as a singer, but he had never seen one, and neither had she. They each had gotten dressed up in the best, most expensive clothes they had. Zeke had on a suit, inverted with a white jacket and black shirt. Though the style was fairly in at the time, when he had seen Addison walk into the room, he felt like he had been dressed like a clown. Her dress was a dark plum color. Its 1-inch straps hung down on her arm, leaving her shoulders bare. It was form-fitting, and it showed enough cleavage to be sexy without losing class and taste. That's when the moment burned into his mind, when the moment he was almost certain would be the last he'd ever think of occurred. She walked into the room where he was waiting. Zeke looked up, and she smiled in a coy way that wasn't just for show. She did a spin, the bottom of the dress flowing out slightly with the movement, and her arms lifted in a half-hearted ballerina motion. In that moment, Zeke had known that he had never and would never see a sight as beautiful as that again. It had remained true, even after nearly 2 decades and a marriage with someone else that came and went. That one moment, Zeke knew, was the one moment that showcased his life most positively. Thinking of Addison on that San Franciscan night so long ago, Zeke could feel his mind turning into a darker space, a space where regret was suffocating. He'd been down that road before, the road where his mind tried to put together every single moment that his life could have incorporated if he had just gone a slightly different way. He refused to go down that road. Not that night. He was not going to ruin that moment. Zeke rolled out of bed and made his way back into the kitchen. Opening a drawer, he pulled out a pre-rolled joint and lit it up as he moved to his back door. Leaning against the open door frame, smoking on the joint that was stronger than Zeke knew he needed, there seemed to be a puzzle subconsciously coming together in his mind. He knew something was piecing together in there, but he wasn't sure what or why. He inhaled a deep puff, coughing as the heated smoke burned on the way down. Clearing his throat, he knocked off the cherry and closed the door. As he did, the ham radio sitting on his office desk made him stop, all the pieces finally coming together in an instant. He could connect with people, random people from all over the country, and give them an outlet to just talk. It didn't matter what they talked about. If they needed to talk, he would be there for them. It was something that he instantly recognized as still worth doing on a planet doomed to complete destruction, something that would help those people face the impending apocalypse with their heads held high by giving them an outlet to rage and scream and reminisce on who they were and what they had done, allowing them to go to the end with the comfort of knowing that someone, somewhere, knew that they had existed, knew that their story had occurred, knew that they had lived.